You're tuned into the Writing Community Chat Show, the live streaming YouTube podcast that brings you the stories of authors, screenwriters, and more. Indie or established, this show's for the community, and we invite you to be a part of it. Head to thewritingcommunitychatshow.com for more info. The WCCS. Together as one, we get it done.
Hello and welcome to the Writing Community Chat Show. Hello everybody and welcome to this week's Writing Community Chat Show. We've got a fantastic guest back on the show. You've seen him before if you follow this show, and if not, we can link that right there. It'll pop up somewhere and you can go and check that out with his road to writing and all that good stuff. But for now, we're going to get him back and talk about his brand new book. And we're going to really enjoy that conversation because we really enjoyed it last time and there was so much still to unpack. So you're in for a good show. How are you doing, Chris Hooley? How's your week been?
Yeah, really good so far, Chris. How's things been with you?
It's been one of those weeks where, you know, I really need a drink at the end of it. But I gave blood today for the first time and specifically asked them, would I be okay to drink? And they said, well, not many, take it easy and drink water in between. So just taking it slow. But yeah, it's one of those weeks where a drink is required at the end of it.
Nice. Giving blood. What a noble thing to do, my friend. Yeah, I'm sure somebody will appreciate that at some point in the future if they get into a spot of bother. But yeah, I've been reading Start With Why again this week, and I was thinking before I came onto the show, I was like, what is our why? Why are we doing this? Like, why are we chatting to these people? And I thought, do you know what it is? It's we are trying to help people be the best writers that they can possibly be. I think that's our why, and I think that's what it always has been, because we got into this by going, we don't feel like we're the best at it. We want to learn a little bit more. Who can we speak to? Who's going to help us? Who's going to teach us some tips and some things? And now we've got over 350 shows and we've had some really good conversations about writing. And tonight's guest he literally blew my mind last time. And I'm so glad that he's coming back on, because his process, everything that he talked about, his level of detail that he goes into is just perfect advice. And again, if we go back to our why are we doing this? To help people get better, to help people improve. Tonight's guest is definitely that type of person.
Absolutely, and well said. Yeah, I agree. It was a very good interview. So please do go and check that out if you haven't seen it. And this brand new book that he's got went straight into #1 in the Amazon ghostly thrillers charts, straight in there. So you're in for a good read if you go and pick this up tonight. And we will leave a link to that book in the description after the show. So if you haven't yet got it, please do go and get it. But yeah, so Chris, reading those sorts of books, have you got any inspiration or tips from those books?
I've got loads of tips, but this is the best one. So it says to find your why. If you don't know what your why is, he was talking about how he was struggling to run a business. He was struggling to get up in the morning. And he says this tip. So he says to ask a best friend questions about why they are your best friend. And he said, and they won't be able to answer it, and it'd be really frustrating for them. And they'll be digging deep. And at some point in the conversation, if you just let them keep trying to answer, they will say the thing that is the reason they are your best friend, and that's your why. So for him, it was that he was inspiring and he was good to be around, and that was the reason why they were friends. And then he was like, that's my reason why, because I want to inspire people. Yes. And he went from there, and obviously his whole business has taken off as a result of that, and that's what he's doing in the field. He's just trying to inspire people. So maybe try that. He says, don't do it with a partner because they're too close. Don't do it with a family member because they're too close. But do it with a best friend and just keep probing until your why materializes. So yeah, that's my tip.
And hopefully there is a why. Otherwise, it would be a bit awkward. Yeah. Well, hello to everyone in the chat. Anna, she says she definitely needs a few drinks after this week too. So we are we are here for that venting too. So if you need a vent, please offload. But of course, we're here to chat to our guests. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest, and then we can get stuck into a brilliant conversation about all things writing and ghostly and all of those things. So if you have questions for tonight's guest, get them in throughout the show. Enjoy the conversation and getting engaged in the chat with the other people that are watching too, because you can make good friends with the people in the chat. And there have been many of those become friends because of that. So tonight's guest is no stranger to the show. In fact, we've had the honor of speaking with him before, as Chris mentioned, about his incredible writing journey, from being trusted by the Bram Stoker family to write Dracul, to penning some of the most gripping thrillers and horror series of our time. He's a master of suspense, a storyteller who never fails to keep readers up at night. And he's just released his brand new ghost thriller that's already #1 on Amazon, Something I Keep Upstairs, that way, inspired by a real-life haunting on Wood Island. And one of the reviewers said, "Ooh, this book is all things creepy and scary and things that go bump in the night. It's got proper old school horror, an old school horror feel to it, and it reminds me of a lot of the books I read back in the 80s when I was a teenager. So prepare to become a teenager again when you read it. And in the meantime, let's welcome the incredible JD Barker back to the show. Hello, JD.
Hey, how you guys doing?
We're
So
doing
I'm
very
sitting
well.
here. I feel like a slacker. You give blood and then you start drinking. Like that's hardcore. I can't do that. And like all I've got here is some water. Like it's Friday. I feel I just I was in New York about a week and a half ago doing some interviews, and I did one on Sirius XM, the satellite radio station. And he had asked me earlier what my favorite drink was, and like I always order a white Russian when I go out somewhere. I've got no idea what's in it or how to make it, which is probably a good thing because I don't want to be able to make it at home. But you know, it's got some pretty strong alcohol in it, and it's basically tastes like adult chocolate milk, so you don't really tell that you can't tell it's got alcohol. But I did this interview on Sirius XM, and when I showed up, he had all the ingredients and he made white Russians for us live on the air. And
Wow.
I tend to drink a lot while I'm talking, you know, just in general. I've got a cup of water in front of me and I'm just constantly hitting that water. There was no water in this studio. There was nothing but the white Russian. So an hour of doing an interview, drinking white Russians. I guess he was on to something because he definitely gets his guests talking. And now you got me thinking about this whole why thing. You know, I think I read once that you're supposed to surround yourself with like 5 people that inspire you, like at any given time, and then you're going to take something away from those 5 people. That's kind of what I've been kind of chasing, I guess, over the last couple of years since I heard that. But you know, you are kind of made up of the people that you hang out with.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And wow, it's an interesting way to get people talking on the show as well, because I think people who might tense up a little bit on camera and maybe reserve a few things, once they're loosened up a bit in that sense, then potentially that's a good show to tune into.
Yeah, especially when you got them live.
yeah, you can't edit that.
Nope.
Yeah, so JD, how are things with you at the moment? And you know, the book release has just happened, so what's that been like for you the past couple of days?
Yeah, it's been fun. We did the book release on Tuesday, and we actually had the release party on the island in the haunted house, you know, where the book takes place. So we had, you know, everybody meet us at the docks. I had ferries running everybody back and forth, and we had roughly about 100 people or so at this book signing and book launch. And for me, it was great because I'm on book. It's funny because I'm going to backtrack a little bit here, but I had to write a speech for this thing. And when I sat down in the morning, I wrote that I had 12 books out. And then I figured, well, I better check Wikipedia. So I checked Wikipedia, and it turns out I've got 18 books out. So I was like totally wrong. But like out of all those books, I've never done a book launch. I've never had any kind of party to celebrate. The book just kind of comes out. I do a couple interviews that day and, you know, move on with my life. So it was really cool to have a bunch of people gathered to, you know, have the book come out that day. And my wife and daughter were there. My sister flew in. So I had a bunch of friends and family around. It's just fun to celebrate that. My daughter is 7 and she signed every book right along with me, which was really cool.
Wow.
So it's priceless experience.
Yeah, it sounds incredible. And, you know, not to have done a book launch before and then to take it to that extent where you go and visit the location, you get people over there. What was the vibe like generally? Were people excited to go to that location, or were they a bit kind of timid about the whole thing?
Yeah, well, probably about a quarter of the people that we invited were press and influencers and people like that had already read the book. They had gotten advanced copies of it. And the cool thing about it is, you're going to an island, a private island, which is pretty cool by itself. Then it's a haunted house on the private island. But the people who run the house, they're turning it into a museum. It's going to open as a museum this year, and they decorated the interior to match my book. Because like I was writing the book while they were doing the renovation, and it all kind of fell together. And like, we have to buy furniture. We might as well match the book because that's what people are coming here to look for. So when you walk through the house now, it feels very much like you are standing in the middle of the story. And for me, it was a surreal experience just because I wrote it. Now all of a sudden I'm in the rooms that I wrote about. But it just seeing the expressions on people's faces as they step into these different rooms, and tidbits of the story start coming back to them, and everybody's searching for the basement and all these things. We had a couple paranormal investigators out there too. I haven't touched base with them, so I don't know if they found anything. But it was a good time. Yeah,
I imagine that is an incredible thing to experience as a writer, and to go in there and see that for yourself. Was it kind of a strange experience in that, knowing that you'd written that and then you could see it almost visually? I imagine that's something a lot of writers would love to see.
Yeah, I mean, because I've been in and out of that house a bunch of times. The first time I saw it, they had literally taken it down to the studs to put it back together again. And I had the floor plan for the house in front of me pretty much the entire time I was writing the book to make sure I stayed true to that. But seeing the place now, like what actual finishings inside, and floors done, walls done, and everything, it's hard to explain. It's very surreal. I had a similar vibe. I wrote that prequel to Dracula that you mentioned at the beginning, and I had never been to Ireland, but the bulk of the book takes place in Ireland. So after the book was released, we went on the tour, and we eventually ended up in Dublin. So I got to stand in the same streets that I had in the book, and it's such an odd feeling, because in that, I knew that place is 1800 something Ireland, so like a lot of those things still exist. So I would stand in front of like a church that I had in the story, and everything in that church, the way it looks, the facade was identical to the way I described it. But then like right next to it will be a bank and a McDonald's, so it's like now you're back in the 21st century again. But it was cool, at the time, to walk in Bram's footsteps.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be amazing. I'm also interested in the way that you said you had to check how many books you actually released. So during that obviously amazing career that you've got in terms of your publishing, at what point does that become a blur where you just, obviously people kind of forget how to pitch their book because they're moving on so quickly to the next? But out of all those books you've done, is there anything or any story that's really stuck out for you in those past 18 books?
Well, I've learned to keep it straight, first of all, because it does get confusing. Like when I turn in a book, it takes about 2 years for it to come out. So even though I've got 18 published books, I probably have another 4 or 5 that are in the pipeline, working their way through. I've got 10 to 12 right now that I'm actually working on. So it's kind of hard to keep track of all that. And with them coming out in different countries, that happens all the time too. So I've got, like you take a book like The Fourth Monkey, it's on, it's still on the bestseller list in various places. So it's constantly releasing in new places. So it'll come out in, let's say, Bulgaria. And I'll have to get on a Zoom call like this and pretend like it's a book that I just finished writing, more or less, like it's a brand new book, even though I wrote it back in 2014, 2015. So that can get a little odd. But it's fun, like there's no other way to describe it. I mean, just every time, that book launches, it's a crazy experience.
Yeah, that's bonkers. I think it must be very odd to see your book in a different language or written in a different language. I know a lot of authors come on and they have those copies. Is it something you do, keep the copies of the ones that are translated?
Yeah, I mean, all the ones basically on the shelves behind us, that's the translated copies of everything. I'm in 150 different countries, so I get a lot of them. What gets me is every time they do a printing, they send me a full case of the book. And like it's for, like, I want one, like it's cool to have one copy of the book in Russian or whatever language, but like I don't need 12 every single time they do a reprint. And I can't bring myself to throw away books. So I bring them to like the local libraries. They use them for their their language studies. And things like that. But I try to give them away as much as I can. A lot of times I get them and I'm not even sure what book it is, because like the cover is different, so I got to try and find some keyword that, tells me what the story is or who the character is and kind of remind me. But yeah, it's cool.
It's one of the most fascinating things I think about that process is the fact that they change the covers and then you receive those covers. I mean, Do you think that they should stick with it, or do you think it's okay to change them up for different audiences?
Well, initially, I kind of fought that. I wanted to have like the same cover on the book everywhere in the world. But as the book started rolling out, I realized that what's trending, like in the US is very different from what's trending in Italy or in Spain or in, Mexico. Like every place has their own, it could be a color scheme, it could be a certain font, something that at that moment is hitting, and you want to take advantage of that. So initially I pushed back on all the cover designs, and, I fought him on it. I made sure my name was the right size, and I liked this and I didn't like this, change this, that kind of stuff. But ultimately I just decided, like, they know their local market, they know what they're doing. You got to let them control all of that. So it kind of depends on the book. So like the ones that come out here in the States, like something I keep upstairs, I commissioned that cover. I had an artist create it. I was very hands-on with the entire thing. But it pretty much ends in, here in the States, in the English speaking countries.
Yeah. Amazing. Chris, do you want to jump in there? Because I've just been chatting away.
No, it's all right. I've got a sort of query in terms of how do you navigate that process of, you plant a seed, essentially. It sounded very much like pregnancy to me. Like you finish this book, you wait 9 months to a year or whatever for it to come out, but then obviously you're writing as well. So how do you manage to navigate the two in terms of, I'm staying in this moment, writing this book, but I've also got this shiny book coming out that I wrote 2 years ago, and I've got to celebrate that and enjoy that moment as well. But I'm still very much in work mode here on this novel. So how do you navigate that?
I kind of break up the day in a way where it works. So like when I get up first thing in the morning, I hit the desk at 7, and I just start writing whatever my current book is. I don't even look at the internet until I get my word count in for the day, which is usually about 2,000 to 3,000 words. Then after that, I flip the internet switch and deal with all the emails and everything on the business related stuff. And then after that, I either work on editing. If I've got a book that's coming out and it's in the editing stage, I'll work on that. If I don't have one of those, I'll work on an outline for a future book. But I've always, it's almost like I'm jumping around. Like I've got 2 or 3 projects that I'm always working on at the same time. So when I finish one up, I just kind of shuffle a new one into that slot and just kind of keep going. So I don't have any kind of lull or quiet time in between. I've got plenty of author friends, they'll write a book and then they'll turn it in, and they'll take 3 months off or 4 months, and until trying to get a little quiet time. And I can't do that. Like I need to work on this every day. I'm a workaholic.
And JD, you mentioned before about the 7 people or the 5 people that are sort of like you get around and they inspire you and influence you. So who are those people in your life?
I mean, it's a lot of the big name authors. I know Dean Koontz pretty well. He's given me a ton of advice. Stephen King's been very helpful. Working with Patterson has been priceless. So those are probably the 3 big ones that you guys would know. Other than that, it's friends and family, just people that inspire me. I mean, I love to sit down and have a conversation with somebody that can surprise me, or teach me something new. I'm always trying to learn.
So those 3 that you mentioned, Coates and King and Patterson, obviously the envy of most writers, the fact that they are, in your close circle. But what have they each taught you that's helped you along your writing journey?
Koontz was very helpful. Like, first of all, I met him because we sent him an ARC copy of the Fourth Monkey to review, hoping to get a blurb out of him. And then we just got, over years, we just cultivated a friendship through email. So it's no different than any other business. I mean, you create contacts, you cultivate that, you turn it into a business relationship. So that's kind of how they've all come about. But he was very instrumental in just shaping how I would publish. My Wikipedia page is defined very similar to her or to his. I define myself as a suspense author who may include elements of horror, sci-fi, this or that. I did that on purpose because I didn't want to get pigeonholed into writing one particular type of book. Like that scares me. Lee Child was one that kind of, like his career is fantastic, but I don't want his career because, he wrote a couple of books that, didn't take off. Then all of a sudden the Reacher book did take off, and he got stuck writing those Reacher books over and over and over and over again, the same book, but different. Like that, I do not want to do that. So Kuntz, very early on, he told me to take a look at his Wikipedia page, come up with a common thread, something that works where I could bounce around between genres and then follow through with it. So if you look at the books that I published, my first one was a horror novel. Then I did a thriller. Then I did the prequel to Dracula. So we're back into horror. Then I released another thriller. I purposely bounced back and forth between the genres. And what I find is it's almost like being a literary Pied Piper. I'm grabbing people from this audience, from that audience, and bringing them all together. At one point, I was told that my primary reader was women 45 and over. So I wrote a young adult book that would also appeal to my older fans. And that allowed me to rope in people in their teens and their 20s. That book today is taught in high school because it's basically used as a gateway into reading Great Expectations and Charles Dickens and stuff like that. So I use genre as a way to kind of branch out.
So with genre then, obviously you mentioned two there that you're really keen on with horror and thriller. What's your purpose when you're writing these books?
I don't know if there's like a defined purpose. I mean, if anything, just to entertain. I always tell people that I write literary popcorn. You're not going to find any, huge life-changing moment or, meaning in any of my books, but, I'm hoping I can distract you for a couple hours, take you away from whatever's going on in your life and just entertain you, just sort of like a good movie.
Yeah, that's a good answer. On that topic of writing thrillers and horrors, is there a true sort of love for you in either direction, or is it something you just really like writing both of? Because I imagine a lot of people really prefer writing sort of one genre over another, or is it kind of equal for you?
If I had to pick one, I think I prefer horror. When I was young, one of the very first adult books that I ever picked up was Dracula. I found it at a yard sale when I was 8 years old, and it's the first book that ever scared me to the point where I had to leave the lights on for like a couple of weeks, I think, at night. And I've been chasing that emotional reaction ever since, either in my own writing or in stuff that I read. Trying to recreate that. And horror, to me, it's easier to do that. Like you can pull it off in a thriller. But not quite as much. Thriller is more about pacing, just fast paced action, that bam 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 bam. Horror, you can slow down a little bit. You can really dig in deep. You can get a little bit more graphic. So I combine a lot of them. If you read a book like The Fourth Monkey, there's a lot of horror elements in there. There's a lot of very frightening graphic type moments that you wouldn't typically see in a thriller. But I think that's why it works. I think that's why people like it, because they're picking it up as a thriller and they're finding something a little different.
So interestingly then, with the comment that I read at the start of the show, that was a review on Something I Keep Upstairs, the person said it made them feel like a teenager again, and the kind of things they read in the horror world as a teenager. So is that something that you actually kind of work towards, knowing how much you respected Dracula as a young person yourself?
I think with this particular book, it's the vibe that I created. It feels very much like an 80s Stephen King kind of thing. Not because I was chasing Stephen King, but I wanted that particular feel. The story is told from a point of view of a 17-year-old kid. The protagonist and his friends are all high school. They're juniors and seniors in high school. So I think that is a big part of that. And I honestly like telling stories that take place a little while, like in the 80s and the 90s. Especially with horror, it's more fun. There were no cell phones. It's easier to create isolation, which just makes things a little bit more spooky. It's a lot tougher to do that in today's world. You can't disappear in today's world.
Yeah. I mean, that is a thing we were blessed with when we were younger. The ability to just go out, in the middle of the day and come back when the street lights came on, and there was no connection or contact. So the risk factor seems higher, but also at the same time, we all felt safer. I think it was bizarre timings.
We're all still alive, right?
Yeah.
So JD, with horror then being so universal, obviously you've mentioned about your fan base at one point was 45-year-old women. Then you moved to teenagers. Obviously, Something I Keep Upstairs has a teenage protagonist as well. So what is it about horror that you think is universal, and how do you write that into fiction?
Well, I think again, it's that emotional reaction. You're chasing an emotional extreme. And you could do the same thing with a romance novel or a fantasy novel. It's all about hitting that, that reaction. Personally, I like to scare people, but sometimes people like to laugh. I couldn't write comedy to save my life. Comedians to me have one of the hardest jobs on the planet. But people go to them, people read them just because of that. They make them laugh at a time where they may not feel like laughing. I tend to scare people when they want to forget whatever else is going on in their life. And life today can be pretty scary. So it's not that easy to frighten somebody in today's world.
So with that in mind, it not being easy to scare people, how are you doing it? Are you getting advice from, like you said, the 7 people in and around you? Obviously, some of them are some of the greatest horror writers, in my opinion, anyway, that have lived. So what's that process like? Does it have to scare you on the page before it scares somebody else, or?
Typically it does. Like when I was writing this book took me about 4 years to write, and I can typically write a book in 3 to 4 months. I kept putting it aside, for a lot of reasons. I would write something that just kind of freaked me out, and I wanted to think about it a little bit before I went on. A lot of it is real. It's based on a real place. There's real history there. So I would stumble into something in my research that I wanted to include. So I put the book aside for a little while to figure out how to make that happen. But typically what I find really scares people is if you can come up with a premise that seems like it could happen today, like something that feels like you could turn on the news and it is there, it's going on right now. One of my favorite movies is a movie called Reign of Fire with Matthew McConaughey. I don't know if you remember this one. It takes place in London, and they're digging, I think, a subway tunnel, and they open up a cave and a dragon flies out, in modern day London. And all of a sudden there's like 2 or 3 dragons, and they completely destroy the world. They obliterate everything. But the premise of it and the way they did it seems perfectly logical. You could turn on CNN and see a dragon flying out of a hole in modern day London, and it makes sense. Much more so than you flip on Game of Thrones and there's dragons, but it's a fantasy world. So that's kind of how I try to approach this. I try to come up with something scary that could happen to, your next door neighbor.
Yeah, I love that idea though, especially in the modern world. And do you know what's crazy is we get so many videos that may be real, maybe fake, whatever the case may be, of things happening, and we're so dismissive these days just to it's just another video. But we could literally be watching a dragon fly around, just assume it's AI these days, and not really take it for granted as a real thing.
Yeah, and it's getting trickier. I've got a podcast called Writers Inc., and one of the things that we talked about this week is the BBC just released a writing teaching course with Agatha Christie. So it's a full-on deep fake of Agatha Christie live video, giving you writing tips. And they pieced this together, through AI, through stuff that she left behind, through other things that she wrote. But you don't know what's real and what's fake anymore. So so if somebody were to send me a video right now, if I opened up TikTok and I saw a dragon flying around, the Washington Monument here in the States, I would probably be dismissive of it, because you don't know what's real and what's not. And, unless it happens right outside your window. And even that, it's funny, because I remember when 9/11 happened. I was working for a brokerage firm at the time, and we had CNBC on live and on the air, and their studio is fairly close, so they walked outside with cameras, and there were people standing in the street holding up their cell phones, taking video of the towers coming down, literally right there in front of them. It was almost like they felt like they were watching an event unfold, not realizing that they could actually get hurt because it was really unfolding. We've been so desensitized to all these different things, we don't even feel the danger of it anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's obviously a new challenge for writers who love to write horror or thrillers or whatever the case may be, or science fiction, because things are changing so rapidly at the moment. Then there's a whole new world to tap into in terms of writing. Like Black Mirror, for example, have really lent into that over the past few years, and with a new series. So is that something that you are going to consider in your future books at the moment? Is that bringing that new technology in, or in regards to something I keep upstairs, are you kind of hoping to keep things back when the times were less technological and a bit more simple?
Welcome to talking after giving blood and drinking. You know, I bounce back and forth. I mean, my last book, it was called Behind a Closed Door, and it was based almost 100% on the latest tech. It was all based on how our cell phones listen to us and the terms of service that we agree to when we load apps on our phones. So I dove, you know, headfirst into that. So I'm comfortable working in both worlds. I think it just depends on the story. For this one, it felt like I needed to go back a couple of years for a few different reasons. You know, the house itself, like I mentioned, was real. I was basically creating a fictitious timeline for it. So back in 1948, it was owned by the Coast Guard. In real life, they gave the house to the town of Kittery, which is the municipality right next to where the Coast Guard base was. So the town took it over. In my book, they sold the island for $1 privately. And then I created a fictitious timeline that takes off from there. So that means I had to work within the years of that particular timeline. And I wanted to bring it to present day, you know, where today, you know, they're turning it into a museum. So at the end of the book, that's the exact same thing that's happening. So I had to work within that window. So that's basically what created the timeline that had to take shape for this book.
Yeah.
In a lot of these books where the main events take place in a house, people always say that the house itself becomes a character. So obviously this house that you've set it on, it has a lot of character in itself anyway, but how do you put that character onto a page? And did you take that approach in terms of this house needs to be a character within itself?
I think you have to, you know, and a lot of times it could be the location, you know, like New Orleans is a great example. You know, like New Orleans, the city has a particular smell to it, a particular look. You know, that smell and look will change from 12 o'clock in the afternoon to 12 o'clock midnight. You know, like you have to be cognizant of all that. And if you include those kind of details in the book, it just makes it seem that more real. With this, you know, it's a real island, a real house, you know, so I had a lot of things I could pull from. So I got as descriptive as I possibly could.
Wow. What does it smell like? Can you describe it or not?
New Orleans or the house?
Yeah, well, yeah. New Orleans.
New Orleans, have you ever been there?
No.
So it's crazy because it's literally a party town 24/7. But they do a fantastic job of cleaning it up. So it smells very much like a club. You know, when you get to like 11 o'clock at night, 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, it smells like beer and a lot of other things pretty much everywhere. But they literally clean the whole town down. It's like they hose it off in the middle of the night. So by 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, it is all sparkling and clean and fresh and ready to start over again. And you know, if you're writing about it, if you're living there, you know, you need to describe those kind of things because I think that's important. You know, Chicago's got a very different vibe than New York. Boston's got a different vibe from both of them. You know, London is different from all of those. You know, you have to. You know, you don't necessarily have to go there. You know, in today's world, we've got Google, we've got plenty of videos you can watch. You can piece enough of it together. But sometimes it does help to actually be on site, at least for a little while.
Yeah, definitely. Is there somewhere in that case then you'd like to discover or to travel to in the name of research that you haven't been to?
The only one that's really on my bucket list right now is Egypt. I'd love to go to Egypt. I'd love to visit the pyramids. I'm watching all this stuff really closely. I don't know if you've heard this yet, but they found like these tunnels and structures and things underneath the Great Pyramids. They think are actually there. I would love to somehow get involved in that research. But I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not the kind of guy they're going to call. You know, but that fascinates the hell out of me. You know, like people in a lot of ways we're naive. You know, like this planet has been around for billions and billions of years. People in you know this incarnation, we've been around for around 400,000 years. You know, that is a drop in the bucket. We've got no clue what happened, you know, 2 million years ago or 20 million years ago or 1 billion years ago. You know, it's all just guesswork, you know. So when they find something like that, it, you know, to me, it's just another little bit of history. I think it might end up changing everything that we know.
Amazing.
Yeah, definitely. JD, I'm really interested when you go back to write a novel that's like set 40 to 50 years to where we currently are. How do you manage the sort of social and political aspects of where we are now and sort of navigate the characters in that time?
I stick to whatever was true in that particular point in history. To give you an example, I have a book that I'm working on now that takes place in the Deep South here in the U.S. in the 60s. There are obviously a lot of civil rights things going on. The way people spoke, very different from today. But I will double down on the language that was used back then, the way people treated each other. I will keep it as real and authentic to the real world as I can. And I get that that's going to offend people today. But I think it's important that we do kind of keep that thing alive. Like, we need to understand, why something is offensive. And if we just whitewash it, pretend it didn't happen, we're going to forget. And that's, when things tend to repeat. So, I try to be true in just about everything. I mean, I get pushback on a lot of stuff, a couple of years ago, like diversity was a huge thing. Like, my publisher would pick up a book, they'd have somebody read it, and they'd say, well, you need to have a person of this, or a person like this, or somebody who speaks like this. You need to include that in the story. I'm like, yeah, but in this particular city, this particular time, that wasn't a thing. And I've pushed back on that. I try to hold true to the story, not necessarily what's happening in today's world.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
How do you navigate that pressure?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Chris. I was just saying, how do you navigate that pressure in terms of if you've got, maybe publishers saying you need this, and obviously you've talked about the story being the most integral part of it. But can you give us any sort of examples where you've doubled down and sort of like how you've managed it and navigated it?
Like A Caller's Game is a book I wrote a few years ago. Are you familiar with George Floyd and everything that happened here around that time? Okay, so this book was going shopping to publishers around the same time that all happened. And there's an opening scene with a cop in New York, and I had a couple paragraphs, literally 2 or 3 paragraphs, where he was complaining about the body cam that he has to wear 24/7 when he's working, and how that footage gets, can be construed and used against him. And these are real thoughts by real cops. This is how they feel. But the publisher pushed back on it. They felt that, because of the stuff that just happened with George Floyd, that the general public would be offended by reading that kind of thing. And they're like, you should just take that out. I didn't take it out, so I basically, I'll tell, I'll hear them out, if they have a legitimate reason and I feel it makes sense, I'll do it. But, to me, a story is a story. Everything is there for a particular reason, and outside influences like that, I don't think should shape the story.
Interesting. I like the idea of, going into that sort of real element and real thought process behind that. Is it something you talk to police officers about, what they feel about wearing that sort of camera body or body worn cameras? Is that something you actually researched?
Yeah, I speak to people in all types of different professions. That's one of the reasons why I like co-authoring. I wrote a book about a year ago called Heavier the Stones with a woman named Christine Daigle. In real life, she's a neuropsychologist. So I could fake my way through that knowledge base, through Google searches and things like that if I needed to create a character. But having that authentic voice in the writing room, that's priceless. You can't beat that. So if I have a book that's about an archaeologist or about a doctor, right now I'm writing one that's based on a plastic surgeon. So I, got a hold of a plastic surgeon, and I've had tons of conversations with her to make sure I'm getting in, properly in her head, like what's going on in her mind. If a patient walks in and asks her to do this, and that, what is she thinking? Because the book itself is being told from her point of view. So I want to make sure I have those thoughts right. And again, like I could fake it, but that's not authentic. So it's worth picking up the phone, having a couple of Zoom calls. And you'd be surprised, if you're an author, people are willing to talk to you. On the law enforcement side, all the big agencies here in the States have, liaisons specifically for that. So if you're writing a CIA character, there's people at the CIA who are specifically there to help you shape your novel and make sure it's authentic. You just have to reach out.
Wow. I was going to ask the question that how would you advise people who have never really reached out in that sense, how to approach reaching someone and not sounding too kind of forceful perhaps, or maybe asking too much? How can they make that connection?
Most people I think are flattered by it. You just send them a quick email off their website. Just say, hey, I'm an author. I'm writing a book about this, and that. I'd love to speak to you about this. And, I don't think I've been turned down yet. People like to talk about that kind of stuff. I think they like the fact that you're taking the time to, to get their particular profession or their life correct, so they're willing to help.
Yeah.
Yeah. JD, if somebody's watching this and maybe they've not written a book yet, and they're taking all your advice and they want to put a little bit of a team together, what advice would you give them to create a team, and what would they need in that team in order for them to be successful?
Well, there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen to write a book. So typically, I work with a lot of I used to mentor a lot of writers. Now I'm working with a lot of co-authors. But I basically teach them a process that I've learned over years and years. I typically start by creating the title, the tagline, and the back of book blurb. So that one paragraph that the book is about. I think it's important to get 200 words, very concise, of what this story is going to be about, and I keep that in front of me the entire time I'm writing. From there, I start shaping the outline, and I put the outline together. And I think once you have that, then you create your characters, and then you can kind of figure out what you actually need in order to fill that. Okay, I've got an airline pilot. I need to find an airline pilot. I've got a taxi driver, an Uber driver. A taxi driver and Uber driver are two very different people. When you talk to them, figure out who your characters are, and then try to find a real life counterpart.
It's cool. It's a good process. I mean, one thing that people might struggle with is that character identity. Like you mentioned, taxi driver, Uber driver, very different people. Have you got a process where some people do research them or interview them? How do you kind of approach your character building?
They all kind of come together in different ways. So let's say I need a taxi driver, and it could be a throwaway scene. They might only be in there for a page or two. But I'll figure out every aspect I need to about them to make them come across as a real person. So I need to know their age. I need to know their name. If I know their name, most of the time I know where they're from. And a lot of times those things play into each other. So, I'll tell myself, okay, my taxi driver is a 42-year-old male from Pakistan. So I will figure out 42 years ago what a popular Pakistan name was for a male, and I'll use that as the basis. I'll find out where that person was from in Pakistan. Is there a certain dialogue or dialect? How does that translate to somebody who's now speaking English? Their English is broken, but it's going to be broken in a certain way. So I just start to piece all these different things together. And you can create somebody 100% fictitious like that. Or you could just hop in a taxi cab and you can tell yourself, I'm going to base this character on this guy who's sitting in front of me right now. And you can use that. And I've gone both routes. I've often told people, if you want to do something quick and dirty, just pick an actor or an actress, for each of your characters. If you take somebody like Ben Affleck, you've got mannerisms, you've got speaking patterns, you've got, everything you need to shape a well-rounded person. And that character may evolve into somebody totally different as you're writing, but it gives you a good jumping off point. And I think if you don't do that, you end up with 5 or 6 characters that all sound and look and act exactly the same because they're you. It's your thoughts and your motivations and everything coming across on the page. If you do it right, and you've got 5 different characters and you ask all 5 of them to do the same thing, they should all give you different answers, as to how they're going to approach it. No different than if you were to ask 5 total strangers how to do something. Everybody's going to have their own opinion, their own way of handling something. Your characters really shouldn't be any different.
Yeah. But perhaps don't base your character on Robert De Niro's Taxi Driver.
Probably not. No.
No. More current, I think. Yeah, brilliant. So it's something I keep upstairs then. I mean, there might be people that haven't actually looked into this yet. So could you give us your pitch? And obviously you mentioned you wrote a whole speech about it, but what is your kind of go-to pitch when someone asks you, what is this book about?
Well, I knew I wanted to write a haunted house book, but I could not do the same story that everybody else does. A family moves into this house, they discover that something happened there, then something happens to them, then something else happens, then something big happens, and they unravel the whole thing. Like, we've seen that same movie, read that same book over and over and over again. So the premise of my book is very different. So let me ask you guys a question. If you're 17 years old and you find out that your grandmother just passed away and she just left you a house on a private island, what are you going to do with that house?
I'm moving in.
You're moving in, and you're going to probably turn it into a party house for you and your friends, right? Because at 17, that's what you do. So that's what my main character does. He inherits this house. It becomes a place where him and his friends can hang out away from the parents, away from the police, and kind of enjoy their last summer together before they head off to college. But partying after a little while gets old, and then somebody raises their hand and say, hey, what would it take to turn this into a haunted house? It's a perfectly normal house. What would it take to flip that switch? So they start exactly where you would expect. They tell a couple of scary stories. And then at one point, somebody brings a Ouija board. But the tagline for the book is, for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. So where they're going as a reader, but the story is, it's all about the journey.
Yeah, it's a great pitch. So without any spoilers then, was there a scene in the book that creeped you out more than any other when you were writing it?
A couple of the things that I heard from real people. So the house itself was used as a Coast Guard life-saving station. And if you go in there in real life, there, on the second floor, there's a hallway that's filled with lockers. And off to the side, there's a giant room that used to be a bunk room. And as they were renovating this house, the construction workers said they constantly heard voices coming from that hallway up there, from the lockers, from the bunk room, always upstairs when nobody was actually upstairs. So that came into play a little bit. One of the things that I'm still researching today, back in 1972, somebody was out there picnicking on the island and they found 2 bodies buried on the beach. And there was one newspaper article that I found on it, and there's photographs and everything. You've got the local district attorney, reporter, police detective, all standing over these bodies in the photograph. They're all quoted, their names are all there. But in today's world, nobody actually knows what happened to those 2 bodies. They were never identified. It kind of became a jurisdictional hot potato because the island is right on the border of New Hampshire and Maine. So both jurisdictions, like, neither of them wanted it. They're like, you take it. No, you take it. You take it. Ultimately, they decided, well, this used to be federal land. The federal government should take it. So the FBI stepped in. So as far as I know, the FBI collected those bodies and took them somewhere, but nobody has a record of it. And I've reached out to all the local law enforcement offices. Nobody's got a file on it. The local FBI office has no file on it. They don't know what happened to these bodies. They don't know what happened to the case. The cool thing is, with this book coming out, I've done a ton of press. It's been on television, where, newspapers, magazines, a lot of people talking about it. The FBI has reopened that investigation. So they're at least trying to track down what happened after that particular day, to see if they can find these bodies, and most likely in today's world, if they find those skeletons, we might be able to find something out through DNA, something that wasn't available in 1972. So I'm really curious to see where that's going to play out.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
So it definitely is. That's exactly what I was going to say, Chris. Took the words right out of my mouth. Obviously, JD, with things that are happening in America at the moment in terms of documentation being released and, people speculating on things and then now having access to new knowledge, does that excite you as an author and a creative, in terms of some of the things that you may have questioned, you may actually be able to get answers to? And is that also a good source of creativity for you, looking into those types of things?
It's honestly, it's bringing back memories, because, like, the Trump administration just released all the paperwork surrounding the JFK assassination. And one of the papers that I wrote in my senior year of high school, I wrote a fiction story about a kid who writes his theory of how JFK died and who killed him. And in my story, his theory turns out to be true. So when that story gets out, like, his teacher has it, but, like, the government finds out that he wrote this, and the people that actually know it's true try to come after him to try and keep him from getting that story out. So he created what he thought was a fictitious story about JFK, just something to get through English class. And it turns out he actually landed on the truth that nobody else, knew at the time. So I'm kind of watching that really closely. It's always felt like something's been held back. It would be nice to know what really happened there. Trump doesn't seem to have a problem opening the vaults. I mean, we're probably going to find out if there's an Area 51 or there's not. Like, he's opening every file cabinet, for better or worse.
Yeah, he certainly is.
I read a really interesting quote before, which was that everyone always follows the leaders, and behind that was people in America stopped wearing hats when JFK came into office because he was a leader that didn't wear a hat. So the hat industry pretty much died overnight because of the leaders. So I suppose my question is, what is your sort of fear for America with the leader that you currently have?
Oh, I don't go there. I do miss fedoras, though. Now that you bring that up, I wouldn't mind fedoras coming back. I'm 54 years old at this point. I've been through so many scary things over and over again. So unless somebody hits that little red button and kind of hits reset on the entire world, we're going to come out of this. There's good and bad all the time. There's always a pendulum swinging in one direction or the other. I just live my life. I when I was younger, I would protest. I would be out there with a sign. I thought I was going to be able to change the world. Like, now at 54, like, I am seeing people protesting, holding up signs for the exact same things that I did when I was 17 and 18, and none of it has changed. And I'm not saying that that's not, people shouldn't get out there and do that sort of thing, but this world, for better or worse, I don't think you can change it that way. So I prefer to just be an observer.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And with your stories then, like, are you Are you ever trying to keep your finger on the pulse in terms of going, oh, this, or is it just a case of whatever comes to you, it's like, oh, this is the next story?
Yeah, that's kind of it. Like if it makes sense for the story, I'll throw it in there. I tend to stay away from current events, including them in the stories unless it's really necessary. Like I'm just thinking it through. Like I don't think I have a single book where I mentioned COVID. Even though I had books coming out during that period. And honestly, to me, like when I pick up a book now, like I just read one that was, came out during that time frame, and everybody's wearing masks and they're social distancing and doing all those things. Like I get PTSD, just reading that stuff. Like I don't want to go back to it. And I probably won't finish that book just because it's in there. Not because it's not a good story. It's a fantastic story, but I don't want to have to keep reliving that stuff. So again, like I mentioned earlier, I tried to write literary popcorn. I want to take people away from the world, not immerse them in it. If somebody wants that particular feeling, they can throw on the news and get it some other way.
Yeah, that's exactly what you're doing, and that's what you need to keep doing, is getting that escapism for everybody else, even if that means throwing them into a very scary world. So what we want you guys to do, the people that are watching, send some questions in for JD, and we'll ask them. We'll put them up on screen if they're decent, and we'll ask some questions, and that's your chance to get some answers that you want. But again, having written horror stories, working with Dracula's story and writing this story, is ghosts something you believe in, or are ghosts?
I'm smart enough to understand there's a lot I don't understand. The only paranormal experience I've ever had, and this is going to sound really silly, have you ever heard of the Stanley Hotel?
Yes.
Okay, so the Stanley Hotel is the basis of Stephen King's The Shining. So him and his wife, they were traveling through Colorado. They stopped at this hotel the night before it was supposed to close down for the season because the winters there get harsh enough where they can't stay open. So they were the only residents in this hotel, and that's how he got the inspiration for The Shining. In today's world, you can still stay at the Stanley, and we were out there for a horror writers retreat, my wife and I and a bunch of other people. Josh Mallerman was there, a guy named Dallas Mayer. He wrote under Jack Ketchum. We tried everything we could to scare something up, make something happen. We were down in the basement at midnight reading scary stories to each other. Nothing happened the whole time we were there. Then the final morning, my wife and I wake up. It's like maybe 9 o'clock in the morning. We're laying on the bed, waiting, trying to figure out what we're going to do for the day. All of a sudden, the bed just starts shaking for like no reason whatsoever. It felt like somebody just grabbed it and was just like literally just rattling the whole frame. It went on for about 30 seconds, and we're like hanging over the sides, looking underneath. We're looking behind it, trying to figure out what's doing this, because there was no noise involved. There's nothing mechanical. We weren't near the elevator or anything that could actually do it. And it stopped as quickly as it started. So we went downstairs and we told the manager, and he's like, "Oh yeah, the bed in that room does that sometimes." So like that was his explanation. So that's the closest thing to a paranormal experience I've ever had.
Wow.
But like when I was studying this house, like I kept stumbling into all these different things. I mean, we had mentioned the construction workers. People have seen, like a little girl running on the beach, and like there's no reason for it because it's a deserted island. Nobody's out there. Lights coming on and off in the house, even though the house has no electricity. Lots of stuff like that. I mean, I found stories dating back 400 years. At one point, even before the house was there, the island was used as a quarantine zone for yellow fever in the Portsmouth area. So if you had yellow fever, they sent you out to that island, and most of those people did not come back. During the Spanish-American War, they used to dock ships out there. So if they captured a Spanish vessel, they would dock it on the island, and they'd literally keep the people on the boat until they died of either starvation or disease. And then they would take the boat because that's all they cared about. The bodies, they just threw them overboard and they fed the sharks because the waters there are filled with great whites. The water's a little warmer, so the fish come in and the seals come in and the sharks come in behind them. So what I kind of stumbled into, and in talking to some of the paranormal investigators, a lot of people have died in and around that island. And a lot of the people that do research this, they feel that life is like a form of energy. Energy doesn't go away, it just dissipates. It moves from point A to point B. So what happens when a lot of that energy gets concentrated in one place? They see an island like this almost like a battery, where all these people, died. That energy basically got stuck on that island, and they think that's why people feel certain things when they go out there. So we'll see. Again, I think it's just one of those things. Sooner or later, we're going to figure it out. Just like we'll figure out what's underneath the pyramids. It might be 100 years from now. My daughter's 7. She might be writing a history book about it when she's 70. And I think at some point we'll figure out what ghosts are, and where all this stuff comes from.
Fascinating. I love all this talk. The sound of a writer's retreat at the Stanley Hotel doing a midnight Ouija board. Oh my God. That's like my dream. I need to get on that.
That was fun.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, Halo's got a question again, guys. Send them in if you've got them. Favorite genre blend? I'm not sure if that means writing or reading.
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, I keep suspense at the core. So basically, every book is a thriller. In this case, I incorporated a lot of horror elements to it. On the cover, we actually called it a chiller, instead of calling it a thriller, which is a term I stole from Peter Straub. He did that years ago. That's probably my favorite. Thrillers with a little bit of horror. I just wrote a novel to reboot the Flatliners franchise. So that's kind of taken three. We've got science fiction, we've got thriller, and we've got horror all mixed together there. So I'll blend pretty much anything if it's interesting.
Yeah.
So JD, with all the obviously author friends you've got, and you talked about Malman being there, and obviously King, if you had to entrust one of those authors to take on a sequel to one of your books, who would it be? And if you had to take on a sequel to one of their books, who would it be, and what book would you pick?
I've written so much with Patterson. I think I would trust him with pretty much any of them. He doesn't get enough credit. He can write in any genre. The guy is extremely creative, very fast and prolific. So I think I would trust him with just about anyone. I've gone back and forth with probably all of them at this point. One of the reasons why a lot of these authors talk to me at the get-go is because I have, co-authored with so many different people and worked as a ghostwriter. A lot of big name authors, they do get pigeonholed in a particular book, and they like the idea of being able to break out. And if they bring somebody like me in as a co-author, you take somebody like Dan Brown, like he's got all these Robert Langdon novels, he has to write another Robert Langdon novel. He doesn't have a choice. There are literally hundreds of millions of dollars riding on that book coming out, but he may have a totally different book in his head they would like to get out. He can't do that on his own, but if he brings in somebody like me as a co-author, now people expect it to be a little bit different, so they can get away with that. So I think that's why a lot of these bigger names like to talk to me about this sort of thing. I'm sure sooner or later you're going to see a couple of these collaborations come out, only because I do talk to these guys about it all the time, and either they're going to get a restraining order or they're going to agree to do it at some point. But we have some fun talks about it.
Yeah. I got a question based on that then. Being a co-author from the perspective as an author, what's the best and what's the worst thing about co-authoring a book?
Well, I think it's important to figure out everybody's strengths and weaknesses straight off the bat and just kind of divide and conquer. I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but the easiest analogy I can come up with, it's like having two cooks in the kitchen making breakfast. If you got two people trying to make eggs at the same time, you stumble over each other and it doesn't work. But if one person makes eggs while the other one's making bacon, everything comes out okay. Co-authoring a book is no different. You can't really do the same thing. That being said, every co-author is different. Like when I work with Patterson, like we can bounce chapter back and forth, chapter by chapter. We can write the exact same characters and we can make it work. And I've worked with other authors where they have to write particular characters in the book. I have to write other characters in the book in order to keep the dialogue sounding consistent. But somebody like Patterson, he can write any of them and he can make it work. So it comes down to the talent and the experience of the person you're dealing with.
Amazing. Is there anything that you've really taken that's kind of benefited your own writing career from working as a pair, that's changed your writing process maybe?
Patterson's changed my writing a ton. At this point, if I write a sentence for anything, I can hear him standing behind me, chatting away. Because when I send him pages, he calls and tells me everything I did wrong. And he's usually right. I get past that little, pushback of not wanting to listen to him, and I actually pay attention to what he's saying. And he's usually right about every one of his points. And I've learned over time to take that in. I mean, there's a reason this guy's the #1, bestseller in the world. He knows what he's doing. And when you've got his ear or vice versa, it's worth taking that advice.
Brilliant.
So from your perspective, working with him, and obviously you just mentioned him being #1 in the world, what do you think he does that other people don't do?
A big part of it's marketing. Like he started, his life as a marketing person. He was in advertising in New York. He created the Toys R Us theme song, that I want to be a Toys R Us kid, like back in the day.
Wow.
And he would write books on the side. But in today's world, he takes that same marketing knowledge and he puts it behind every one of his titles. And like, even when we've got a co-author title coming out, he's got commercials that he's creating. He's hands-on with every Facebook ad, every Amazon ad. He monitors all of that stuff. He uses focus groups for the covers, focus groups for the titles. Everything is done from a business standpoint, not necessarily from the, precious writer, don't change any of my words point, which is where a lot of authors come from. He knows at the end he's selling a widget and he's got to, put it out there in the best possible way. So that's the kind of takeaways I've gotten from it. I think in this world, you have to write a 5-star book. I think that's a given if you want to succeed at all. But that's still only half the battle. Creating word of mouth, creating buzz is the other half, and you have to do something different from everybody else to pull that off.
Amazing. Great answer. I'm going to squeeze 2 questions in from the chat minute, and then Chris you can finish this off because we're nearly at the hour mark. Again, an interview with you, JD, is like a 5-minute conversation every time. It's amazing. Halo says, who would win in a battle to the death? A freshly made zombie, an ancient vampire, or morally conflicted werewolf?
I have no idea. I would probably put my money on, because see, if you break this down, you've got the zombie who's just hard to kill. You've got the vampire who's been around forever, so they're super smart. And then you've got the werewolf who probably has the strength and they're robust enough to handle themselves in a fight. I think the vampire would probably outsmart them in the end. I agree. But I don't want to go all Edward Cullen on you. But.
Thanks for that, Halo. And Anna, thank you. She says, favorite Patterson book that you guys didn't collaborate on?
One of my favorite other co-authors of his is a guy named David Ellis, who's actually a practicing attorney, but he writes some of my favorite Patterson books. I read every one of those. Patterson puts out a lot of books, so I have to be picky and choosy as far as what I read. Along Came a Spider is still probably one of my favorites. So I've read that one a bunch of different times. That's the one that launched his career. So if you're going to start somewhere, that's probably a good place.
Nice.
Brilliant. Yeah, JD, again, always, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. I know, obviously, you're very prolific, so I have no doubt that we'll chat to you again at some point. But it's been an absolute honor chatting to you again, so thank you very much.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Everybody, go and pick up Something I Keep Upstairs. Is it available anywhere else than Amazon? Is it in local stores? Where can they get it from, JD?
Yeah, at this point, it's everywhere.
Everywhere. Go find it anywhere and pick it up.
Anywhere.
And please do get stuck into that. And thank you very much for sharing your story with us again, JD. Like I said earlier, guys, we have his whole road to writing, his introduction to his career, all that good stuff in our first interview. So please do check that out and have a great weekend. That's all that's been left to be said. So thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you all very soon. Bye-bye, everybody.